On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Pacific Ocean was calm, the sky above Hawaii deceptively peaceful. American sailors were finishing breakfast, aircraft sat idle on the runways, and the United States believed itself safely removed from the chaos consuming the rest of the world. Then, without warning, the sky exploded. Japanese aircraft roared overhead, bombs fell with terrifying precision, and Pearl Harbor became an inferno of fire, smoke, and steel. In a matter of hours, battleships were torn apart, thousands of lives were lost, and an isolationist nation was violently dragged into the deadliest conflict in human history. This was not just an attack on a military base. It was the moment the Pacific ignited, and the world would never be the same again. For years before that morning, the United States had watched the rise of global conflict from a distance. Scarred by the losses of World War I, many Americans believed their nation should stay out of foreign wars, focusing instead on recovery and stability at home. Across the Atlantic, Europe was already burning. Across Asia, tensions were rising. Yet America remained hesitant, reluctant to intervene. That hesitation ended in a single, devastating strike. Pearl Harbor transformed public opinion overnight, uniting the country with a clarity and fury rarely seen before. The United States declared war, joining Great Britain and other allied nations in a global struggle that now spanned continents and oceans, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific. The war that erupted in the Pacific was not an isolated conflict. It was deeply connected to events unfolding across the world. World War II, fought between 1939 and 1945, divided the globe into two vast theaters, the European theater and the Pacific theater. Though separated by thousands of miles, these arenas were bound together by alliances, shared enemies, and a single, brutal objective: total victory. The Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, sought to reshape the world through conquest. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, it reinforced this alliance and ensured that the wars in Europe and Asia would become one unified global catastrophe. To understand why Japan launched such a daring and reckless attack, one must look back to the 1930s, a decade marked by ambition, desperation, and expansion. Imperial Japan was facing severe economic hardship. As an island nation with limited natural resources, it struggled to sustain its growing industrial and military power. Oil, rubber, and raw materials essential for war and production lay beyond Japan's borders, controlled by foreign powers. Japanese leaders believed that survival and dominance depended on expansion across the Pacific Rim. This vision placed Japan on a direct collision course with the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China. Japan's first major step toward empire came in 1931, when it invaded Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China. At the time, China was a nationalist state under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, struggling with internal divisions but fiercely resistant to foreign domination. Japan seized Manchuria with overwhelming force and, in 1932, transformed it into a puppet state known as Manchukuo. Though presented as an independent nation, Manchukuo was firmly under Japanese control, serving as both a strategic base and a symbol of Japan's imperial ambitions. From this foothold, Japanese leaders envisioned further expansion into China and across the Pacific. The international response was swift but ultimately ineffective. The League of Nations, created after World War I to prevent future conflicts and protect national sovereignty, launched an investigation into Japan's actions. The League concluded that Japan had illegally seized Chinese territory without declaring war and formally condemned the invasion. But condemnation came without enforcement. Japan's leaders, unwilling to retreat and emboldened by the world's inability to stop them, responded by withdrawing from the League of Nations in 1933. It was a powerful signal that international cooperation was unraveling. Soon after, Nazi Germany also abandoned the League, further accelerating the collapse of the fragile peace established after World War I. By the late 1930s, the lines were drawn. Japan aligned itself with Germany and Italy, forming an alliance that would endure until the war's end in 1945. Each Axis power pursued its own vision of dominance, but together they challenged the existing global order. In Asia, Japan expanded its influence through brutal warfare, while the United States watched with growing concern. Economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure followed, particularly as Japan's need for oil and resources became more desperate. These pressures only intensified Japan's resolve, pushing its leaders toward a dramatic, high-risk gamble, cripple American power in the Pacific with a single, decisive blow. Pearl Harbor was meant to be that blow. Instead, it became the spark that unleashed American industrial might, military determination, and global resolve. The Pacific War that followed would be unlike anything the world had seen before. It would be fought across vast oceans and remote islands, in suffocating jungles and on blood-soaked beaches. It would demand unimaginable sacrifice, leaving millions dead and entire cities reduced to ashes. And it would ultimately culminate in the most destructive weapons ever used in warfare, forever changing the nature of conflict and the course of history. This was the beginning of the Pacific War, a brutal struggle born from ambition, fear, and fire. And it was only the first chapter of a story that would test the limits of humanity itself. Long before American forces stormed the beaches of the Pacific, Japan was already at war. After seizing Manchuria in the early 1930s, the Japanese Empire pushed deeper into China, tightening its grip on territory it believed was essential for survival and dominance. Tensions between the two nations escalated relentlessly, fueled by nationalism, military ambition, and a belief within Japan's leadership that conquest was both justified and inevitable. By July 1937, these tensions erupted into full-scale conflict, igniting the Second Sino-Japanese War and unleashing a level of violence that would shock the world. As Japanese troops advanced through China, the war quickly descended into brutality. Cities fell, villages burned, and civilian populations became deliberate targets. No event symbolized this cruelty more than the Nanjing Massacre. In December 1937, Japanese forces captured China's capital, and what followed defied comprehension. Entire communities were annihilated. Tens of thousands of women were raped, tortured, and murdered. The death toll soared into the hundreds of thousands as executions, mass killings, and unchecked violence continued for weeks. By the time the assault ended in February 1938, Nanjing lay in ruins, its people devastated, and its suffering etched permanently into history. Japan installed a puppet government in the city, one that would remain in place until the end of World War II, a grim reminder of the human cost of imperial ambition. While China bled, Japan looked outward, seeking allies who shared its worldview and enemies. As its war with China intensified, Japan aligned itself with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, forging bonds that would shape the course of global conflict. In November 1936, Japan and Germany signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, an agreement aimed at opposing the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. Adolf Hitler embraced the alliance, viewing Japan as a powerful partner in what he portrayed as a global struggle against communism, a narrative he falsely and dangerously linked to anti-Semitic ideology. Italy joined the pact the following year, completing a triangle of authoritarian powers bound by ideology, ambition, and a willingness to use force. As violence engulfed Asia, Europe stood on the brink of catastrophe. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, triggering declarations of war from Great Britain and France. The Second World War had begun in Europe, but the United States remained officially neutral, determined to avoid being drawn into another foreign conflict. Yet the world's crises were becoming increasingly interconnected. On September 27, 1940, Japan formalized its alliance with Germany and Italy by signing the Tripartite Pact. In doing so, Japan recognized Germany and Italy's leadership in reshaping Europe, while they, in turn, acknowledged Japan's right to establish a new order across East Asia. This agreement gave a name to the growing threat, the Axis powers, and bound their futures together. Backed by these alliances, Japan accelerated its military expansion at a staggering pace. Between 1937 and 1941, its army more than doubled in size, fueled by aggressive recruitment and industrial growth. Even more alarming to Western powers was the rapid rise of Japan's navy. By 1941, the Japanese fleet in the Pacific surpassed the combined naval strength of both the United States and Great Britain in the region. It was a clear signal that Japan was preparing not just for regional dominance, but for a confrontation with the world's greatest powers. In the United States, Japanese aggression did not go unnoticed. President Franklin D. Roosevelt watched developments in Asia with growing alarm. He feared that Japan's expansion would not stop with China, but would spread to strategic territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, including the Philippines, a territory under American control. Incidents such as the 1937 attack on the USS Panay, in which Japanese aircraft sank an American patrol boat, killing sailors and civilians, intensified outrage and concern within the U.S. government. Yet public opinion at home remained deeply isolationist. Many Americans believed the nation should stay out of foreign wars at all costs. Faced with these political realities, Roosevelt pursued economic pressure instead of direct military action. The United States sought to curb Japan's expansion by restricting exports and limiting access to critical resources. In 1940, export controls were imposed. In 1941, full economic sanctions followed, cutting off Japan's access to oil and other vital materials. These measures struck at the heart of Japan's war machine, creating severe shortages that threatened to cripple its military ambitions. For Japanese leaders, the choice became stark: abandon their expansionist goals or seize the resources they needed by force. Driven by desperation and convinced that time was running out, Japan chose war. Plans were drawn to strike American and British territories across the Pacific, from the Philippines and Guam to Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore. The path to conflict was now irreversible. The clash between Japan and the United States was no longer a matter of if, but when. And in Tokyo, military planners were preparing a single, devastating blow they believed would secure Japan's future and shatter American power in the Pacific. The stage was set. The world stood on the edge of a storm that would engulf oceans and continents alike. Before dawn on December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft lifted from their carriers and moved silently across the Pacific. Hours later, they descended upon Pearl Harbor with devastating force. Bombs tore through battleships, aircraft were destroyed before they could leave the ground, and the harbor burned beneath pillars of black smoke. In a single morning, the United States lost thousands of lives and much of its Pacific fleet was crippled. The attack was swift, brutal, and unforgettable. For Americans, it shattered any remaining illusion that the war raging across the world could be avoided. The response was immediate. On December 8, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation, calling the attack a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan the same day. 3 days later, bound by the Tripartite Pact, Nazi Germany declared war on the United States, pulling America fully into both the Pacific and European theaters of World War II. What had begun as a regional conflict now became a truly global war, with American soldiers, sailors, and airmen preparing to fight on two fronts, thousands of miles apart. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan appeared unstoppable. One territory after another fell with alarming speed. Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong were captured in December 1941. In early 1942, Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and Singapore, while also invading neutral Thailand and forcing its leaders to declare war on the United States and Great Britain. Japan's empire stretched across the Pacific, and its advance brought the war frighteningly close to American shores. It was not until mid-1942 that Allied resistance finally slowed the Japanese momentum, as Australian and New Zealand forces fought desperately in New Guinea and British troops held defensive lines in India. The course of the war changed forever in the summer of 1942, during the Battle of Midway. By this point, Japan had pushed relentlessly eastward, threatening to extend its reach toward the west coast of the United States. But American intelligence achieved a critical breakthrough, successfully deciphering Japanese naval codes. Forewarned of the attack, U.S. naval forces prepared a trap. From June 4 to June 7, American and Japanese fleets clashed in a battle that would define the future of the Pacific War. When it ended, Japan had suffered catastrophic losses, 4 aircraft carriers destroyed and roughly 3,000 sailors and airmen killed. American losses, though painful, were far smaller. Midway marked the moment when the balance of power shifted. From that point on, Japan would fight a defensive war it could never truly win. With momentum on their side, Allied forces began a long and grueling campaign across the Pacific. In August 1942, American troops landed in the Solomon Islands, initiating a brutal struggle that culminated in the Japanese withdrawal from Guadalcanal in February 1943. From there, the Allies advanced island by island, battling entrenched Japanese defenders who fought with fanatical determination. Each victory came at a high cost, but slowly, steadily, the United States and its allies gained naval and air superiority. While Japanese forces held out on the Chinese mainland until 1945, their grip on the Pacific Islands weakened with every passing month. By 1944, the tide had fully turned. In October, American forces began retaking the Philippines, delivering a devastating blow to Japan's supply lines and strategic position. That same year, U.S. Army Air Forces launched an intense bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands, while British forces recaptured Burma. In early 1945, the fighting reached a terrifying crescendo. American troops invaded Iwo Jima in February and Okinawa in April, encountering some of the fiercest resistance of the entire war. Kamikaze pilots hurled their planes into Allied ships, turning the sky itself into a weapon. Casualties were staggering, but by June 22, 1945, Okinawa had fallen, leaving Japan exposed and vulnerable to invasion. Even as the Pacific War raged on, victory had already been secured in Europe. On May 8, 1945, Allied forces, including millions of American soldiers, defeated Nazi Germany, bringing an end to World War II in Europe and to the horrors of the Holocaust. All eyes now turned to Japan, where the war showed no sign of ending quickly. In August 1945, the United States made a decision that would forever alter human history. On August 6, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, killing tens of thousands in an instant and condemning many more to slow deaths from radiation. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb devastated Nagasaki. Between the two attacks, an estimated 110,000 to 210,000 civilians were killed. On August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Japanese-held Manchuria, eliminating any remaining hope for a negotiated peace. On August 14, 1945, Japan agreed to surrender. The formal surrender took place on September 2 aboard the USS Missouri, ending World War II at last. The cost of the Pacific War was almost beyond comprehension. Japan lost up to 3 million lives, most of them soldiers. China suffered as many as 20 million deaths. More than 100,000 American service members died fighting Imperial Japan, and over 250,000 were wounded. Civilians across Asia paid an immeasurable price. The Pacific War ended not with celebration, but with silence, broken cities, shattered families, and a world forever changed. It was a war born of ambition and fear, fought with unprecedented brutality, and concluded with weapons that revealed humanity's darkest and most powerful potential. Its legacy remains a warning, echoing across generations, reminding us of the true cost of global conflict.